Hello, everyone, and welcome to the very first Quiet Riot Sunday School, an occasional extra by your new weekly political posse. I'm Naomi Smith.
And I'm Andreou. Welcome to Quiet Riot, the podcast where passion meets rational debate.
And I'm Kenny Campbell, your hobbity producer, sitting in the corner yawning on a Sunday morning.
So, Alex, we left our lovely listeners after our first episode at the moment that Sunak had called his general election on the 4th of July. How do you think his campaign's been going so far?
It's been, I think, a disaster a day is quite a kind way of putting it, because several days there's been more than one.
Yeah. Obviously, the whole launch was a disaster with him like a drowned rat. To convince the country that he wasn't drowning in his own detritus. But what have we had since then? Let's remind listeners.
But can I just say something on the launch? I find it interesting that they've tried to lean into it since then. They've actually put a photo of him walking into Downing Street, soaking wet, as the very last frame of their main party political broadcast. And the voiceover goes, Rishi Sunak will not do the easy thing. He'll do what's right for the country. And I just love the notion that not checking a weather app and making a rational choice may not be the easy thing, but it is what's right for the country.
And then he did an interview in a brewery which we'll come to in itself it was in a pub actually, and he was saying, the number of people that tried to hand me an umbrella in the last couple of days, but it was like, it's what prime ministers do. They go outside and announce the general election to the country. They don't do it inside. Like, just feeble.
Remind me how much we paid again for the Schnazzy Communication
Kenny, what was
Centre?
the press room?
That was about £2.6 million in 2021. In modern money, that's about £2.6 million more than Sunak spends on umbrellas.
And Daniel Finkelstein today suggested that Rishi Sunak couldn't have done the announcement inside Downing Street because it's a political announcement. He wouldn't be allowed, which is utter bollocks, by the way. All he's not allowed to do is use the prime ministerial seal.
Indeed.
And basically use the trappings of power in his political announcement. But he can stand in front of a fucking panelled wall and do a live feed. Doesn't have to be standing outside. Or, as they initially intended, because that's what they told the press, he could have done it inside the door of number 10.
Yeah,
that would have made zero difference. It's just that the rain broke for a moment, so they rushed out of and basically it started pissing down 2 minutes into his announcement.
The weather god spoke. So come on then, since the submerged prime minister emerged from number 10 to call the election, what else have we seen? There's been a pretty aquatic theme to some of it.
Yes. I mean, the trip to Belfast, I think, was a disaster from beginning to end. And when the main theme of your campaign is, we've got a plan, so first of all, on the plane, he was photographed seemingly surrounded by exit signs. Then they sent all the journalists to the wrong place for the press conference, not once, but twice, according to the Belfast Telegraph. So basically, they were waiting somewhere, and suddenly they got messages on their phones, scrambling them to somewhere else. They got to a car park, and there was no one there. And it turns out that CCHQ had got the location wrong twice. And then when they got to the location, it was where they built the Titanic. And even Chris Heaton Harris, the the person who was there with him could not keep a straight face. You could see him trying to stifle his laugh.
Look, the Titanic analogies need no rehash. It's just perfect. But sending people to the wrong place just took me straight back to the Rudy Giuliani Four Seasons landscape gardening presser rather than the Four Seasons Hotel. And look how his career has panned out since then.
When you think of all the rats that have already abandoned Sunak's sinking ship, he's just saying, haha, rats, we're on the Titanic and we're coming down there right after you.
Of course, on the first day, he also threw the Sky political correspondence out of the party launch because it was only approved people. I mean, launching your election campaign in secret, it just seems weird. So then the Sky correspondent was reporting from outside the Excel Centre, quite literally, with burly bouncers following behind
him out,
to make sure he didn't even enter the estate.
And then since then, journalists haven't been allowed onto the battle bus in the way they ordinarily would be. So, yes, this secret campaign continues apace. We're going to get onto it more in a little bit, I think. But had he announced the national service policy that I've just fresh from LBC debating Tobias Elwood over, had he announced that either before or when he was in Northern Ireland, I mean, God help him. That would have really been something. And I cannot see the majority of voters there being even vaguely sympathetic towards it.
I mean, I'd love to see how he would implement it in, Belfast.
Well, indeed.
But like we said, we will talk more on the nationals because I know we both have feelings about it.
What else have you sort of seen in terms of the reaction so far to the campaign from voters? Have we seen the polls shift at all yet?
I mean, our Luke Trill did focus groups on the campaign launches, like on the speeches and how they were received. And I thought the word cloud was fascinating because the central biggest word in the Labour word cloud was change, which is exactly their campaign message, right? Yeah. We represent change. And voters came away from that speech thinking change.
Yep.
The Tory central message is we've got a bold plan. I've heard that repeated again and again and again. And voters came away from that speech, and the central big word in that word cloud was wet. And I think that tells you everything you need to know about how those launches respectively went in terms of trying to communicate the message they were trying to communicate, like on their own terms.
Like a wet diaper, it needs to be changed. Let's move on then. So Nigel Farage, he's not going to be a candidate. He's now finally ruled that out. Still got his eyes very firmly on a Donald Trump prize. But what do we expect he'll be doing in the UK for the election campaign on behalf of Reform UK?
I mean, I saw an interview with him this morning on Trevor Phillips' show.
On Sky?
On Sky News, yeah. And it was genuinely stomach-churning. There is no dog whistle anymore. There is no hiding behind anything anymore. He said, there are people in this country who don't subscribe to British values. And Trevor Phillips asked him, do you mean Muslims? And he said, yes. And he went on and on and on and on about it. That's what Reform is going for, basically.
Well, let's use that then to segue into our second topic, which, as we mentioned, is this policy announcement that broke late on Saturday evening, that's on the front page of the Telegraph, and that Tory grandees have been out peddling this morning, and that is the return of national service, compulsory mandatory national service for 18-year-olds. They can choose to either do military service, which would be paid, or volunteering 1 weekend a month for which they would not be paid. Mixed reports about whether or not they would or wouldn't be sanctioned if they chose not to pursue it. Farage says that this was probably done after the Tories focus group Reform UK voters. And doesn't think it's a good idea himself.
Well, no, I think he thinks it's a good idea. I just think he doesn't think it's a real Tory policy. He basically said they just put a group of reform voters in a room and tried various stuff on them because they're the people they're trying to get back, and landed on national service as something that was attractive to them. So they just adopted it. But he called it a joke in terms of the meat on the bones, I guess.
So the racists that have been coming at me on Twitter since I did my interview with Tobias Ellwood on LBC with Paul Brand this morning on this topic, similarly don't seem to like it, which I thought was quite interesting. And there's been more than one comment saying things like, I won't be told to do military service by an Indian Prime Minister. So it's not even clear that it will be
fascinating
a popular policy with some of the racist voters that would tend to be drawn to some of the remarks Farage made on Sky that you mentioned. It was really interesting going on with Tobias Ellwood, because obviously he was a Remainer. When he chaired the Defence Select Committee, you know, he gave both barrels to Conservative prime ministers, but you know, he was really defending it from the basis that we are now in a much more dangerous era globally. He was obviously in no small part referencing the threat from Putin, but I think also maybe some threats from other places too, and using that as an excuse to say, well, we really need a bigger armed force. And I had to point out to him that under a Conservative government, the armed forces has been slashed in size by nearly 40,000 troops. That, you know, we are not funding Ukraine as much as we ought to be, and that their plan for funding it, which they have currently put at 2.5 billion, though every commentator under the sun is saying they cannot possibly do it for that money, it would cost a lot more. They're claiming that 1.5 billion of that will come from the Levelling Up Fund that was meant to replace the lost EU regional development funding as a consequence of Brexit. So they are now completely, you know, washing their hands of any attempt to try and level up the country if they're going to be diverting resource away from that to this.
The interesting thing about this is I come from a country that does have conscription. Let's call it what it is. And the basic training, as it were, is 40 days. And then you're sent off to guard some border somewhere or do paperwork. A stipend, you know, not enough really if you don't have other sources of income. So what you see very, very frequently is, you know, the kids that basically come from poorer families, they don't even take their leave.
No.
They stay in the barracks because they can't afford to go out, you know, it's
or
basically enough for your cigarettes or, you know, whatever. And the other thing we see in Greece is that it creates a massive amount of sort of low-level corruption. I cannot emphasize enough the low-level corruption this creates. Everyone tries to find someone they know, a cousin, someone in government that can make sure your kid gets the best posting possible rather than go to some dangerous frontier, right? So that's what it does. Cleverly's defense of it was that it will force people to mix with other layers of society and people of different views, and so create a much more civic atmosphere. I have to say, I mean, Cleverly was privately educated. People who are not privately educated, and someone needs to fucking tell them this, they do mix
exactly
with loads of people from other backgrounds and other social.
The problem is, if you went to public school and then to Oxbridge and then to the bar or the military and then like Sandhurst or whatever, and then into Parliament, you've never changed architect, let alone met anyone different from you. So the gall of these people is just staggering. And the main thing that I really went for Tobias Elwood on this morning, because I was really quite angry on behalf of young people, and I felt somebody really did need to defend them, was you talk about instilling resilience and all of these skills in younger people and a sense of civic duty. And I said, if you want that for younger people, and by the way, I believe most of them already have it, you have to be tough and resilient to survive as a young person in today's climate, when you've got no chance of owning a home, when your schools are crumbling around you because of concrete, there's a teacher shortage crisis, you've had to cope with lockdown and remote learning, when your rents are sky high, tuition fees through the roof. All of those things, you are resilient. But even if you accept that they're not, then lead by example. But this is a government that has overseen some of the worst corruption and sleaze that I can remember. We have had not one but two prime ministers who broke the rules and got fined for it. We had a prime minister in Liz Truss who, refused to accept any responsibility for the mistakes she made. And I said to him, begin with yourselves, lead by example, because who are you when you're not adhering to the Nolan principles, when you're not adhering to the rule of law, to force younger people into military service? You need to lead by example and give young people a stake in society, and then they may want to defend it. But at the moment, young people are being offered absolutely nothing by the Conservatives. They're being punished by them so that the Tories can chase the votes of a few older people who, let's add, will not have done military service unless they are very, very, very old, because it ended in 19...
Yeah, they won't have
82 plus.
None of them would
have done it. And yet you've got the Lib Dems, the Greens, Labour, all advocating votes at 16 and giving a real offer of agency to young people. So it's a joke of a policy. It smacks of desperation, and it is horribly discriminatory against the young.
And it's horribly discriminatory in other ways as well. And that, again, is something that I wanted to highlight as someone who has sort of experienced the system. So what happens is they're offering an option to someone to either do a year in the military that's paid, or do sort of a number of weekends for St. John's Ambulance or whatever. So what will happen is this: the people who can't afford to take time off, who work as waiters during the weekend or whatever, will have to choose the military option. So you're putting working class kids into the army, you're conscripting them, while richer kids will have the option of just doing social service during the weekend. And that's what will happen. So they won't mix with each other. Quite the opposite. You're segmenting them. And the long-term effect of that, let me tell you, is catastrophic, because it means that you're telling working class kids that they have to take a year off before starting their career when they finish whatever training or university they do, okay? While richer kids don't have to. They can go straight to the internships and all the training and jobs that will guarantee them a higher income for the future. That's what will happen. And the other thing that will happen is that people will leave, just as I did. So I went to study abroad, right? I read law. I was then offered a scholarship to do the bar and the option to do an economics postgraduate while working. Meanwhile, the Greek army was saying, come back and do national service. What do you think happened? What do you think? So I became a permanent resident abroad, which takes you out of the military service pool. And you will experience a massive brain drain from people who, especially from people who study abroad, who facing the choice at the end of their training to either go into work and start their career or come back and do a year in the army, will all choose to stay away from this country.
There are so many points we can make about all of this. We could touch on the fact that the military don't want to have to train up reluctant conscripts that don't want to be there. There is a whole costing of it. Where will the barracks be? How will they be fed? What will all of that be cost? How will we house these people? What support do we offer people that are demobbed? I mean, look how the current military or ex-military are treated, huge spike in homelessness, mental health issues, etc. We know that we failed them. But then there's also the naked fact that Sunak is just lying. So 5 months ago, in January of 2024, he literally said that he wouldn't do this.
Yeah.
His spokesperson said the Prime Minister did not agree with comments made by General Sir Patrick Sanders in a speech on Wednesday and was forced to insist there would be no return to national service, which was abolished in 1960. So, very few people believe politicians will stop. Even fewer believe Conservative politicians after the last 14 years. And here we go again, says one thing, does another.
There's polling on this.
There is.
That has been circulating that shows it to be quite popular. How do you interpret that?
Well, I would urge all listeners to go on YouTube, and we'll put a link in the show notes, and rewatch the beautiful sketch from Yes Prime Minister, may have been Yes Minister, not entirely sure.
Yes, Prime Minister.
Talk about, well, it depends on which polling question you ask when it comes to national service, and it is all in the framing of the question. I'm sure that some kind of civic responsibility is to be encouraged and welcomed and would be generally popular. But when people think about their own children and their own grandchildren, as you said, Alex, they will move heaven and earth to try and get their own children out of having to do it. And most of the people being polled who are in support of it did not have to do it themselves, and the government is not asking them to do anything in return.
I mean, I found it very interesting. I looked at the question that was actually asked, and it said, would you support a new national service scheme for young people? And the word compulsory or conscription or sanctions, or it appears nowhere. So I suspect if you went to people and say, would you support compulsory conscription, the answer would be very different, but that's just the feeling in me waters. But it's I guess it's random mark too. It's not a thing that will ever happen. It's not a thing that will ever have an effect. It's not a thing that's been costed. Its only function is to please the Express and the Daily Mail and get their front page.
Wrong. Its other function is going to be to get rid of any last remaining antipathy that young people might have to register to vote and turn out to vote.
That's true. Yes, because politically also it makes very little sense. It seems to me to galvanize a group that are very likely to vote Conservative already, maybe attract some people back from Reform, which we have seen will make actually quite a minimal difference, because at the moment, even if you add up their total support, they're still behind in most constituencies. And so the only hope really for the Conservatives was that young progressives would flee Labour in their droves and go to Greens because of unhappiness with Starmer. And they're doing something that is likely to galvanize that group and drive them into Labour's arms. So it's a strange one. It really is a strange one. And what's interesting is that because the rules are extremely strict for broadcasters, what ended up happening not podcasters, but what ended up happening this morning on Kunzberg, for example, is that cleverly spent his entire time there trying to defend Sunak launching the campaign in the rain and all the disasters. And then part two of his interview was trying to defend this national service scheme, while Rachel Reeves spent her 15 minutes talking about her plans for the economy. And just the optics are, again, dreadful, because you see Labour talking, whether you agree with them or not, they're talking about the number one issue in people's lives consistently for every fucking election since elections began. And what you see the Tories doing is talking about some harebrained niche thing.
So we always said that we would give our listeners a call to action. I think we've got 2 for you today. Get every young person registered to vote. Your neighbours, kids, family, friends, get them all signed up and use this as a tool to convince them that actually they really, really do need to do something about it. And the best act of national service they could do is to turn out and vote. And then the second one is go and watch that Yes Minister clip. It's absolute comedy gold.
And that's it from our very first Quiet Riot Sunday School.
Progressives at prayer. You can now follow us on social media at Quiet Riot Pod, or drop us an email with your ideas for future guests and topics to quietriotpod@gmail.com.
We'll be back with a regular episode on Thursday, including a really special panel. Remember to like us, rate us, follow us, subscribe, and generally tell everyone.
Thank you for listening.
Quiet Riot is an audio production by Cooler Heads with Naomi Smith, Alex Andreou and me, Kenny Campbell. Music by Mariana Sangeeta, artwork by Simona Canalou. Quiet Riot is a co-production with Sandstone Global. See ya!